Hello! So this is the answer to your request about a tutorial how to make a time-lapse with the Sony a6000. I plan to make a series of 3 videos. This one will be about the equipment and the camera settings I used. The second one about editing our images in Photoshop. And the last one about converting our images into a video. As you, I'm sure, have noticed, I'm not a native English speaker, so there might be some mistakes and mispronunciations along the way. Still, I hope you understand me so I can share some tips with you. So that said, let's get started. Let's begin with the equipment. We only need a few things. Of course, the a6000, in this case with the 16 to 15mm kit lens. By the way, you can apply most of those tips to every camera, so you don't need necessarily this one. We also need a tripod, and I use this Manfrotto mini tripod, which is really nice because it's so small it fits into a jeans pocket, and so you can easily carry it around, just put it onto a bench, a wall, a boulder, whatever you can use. Although you might have a problem with huge DSLRs with big lenses, but for a small camera like the a6000 it's perfect. I would also recommend a fast SD card with at least 64GB, because we will shoot in RAW and this will require quite a bit of space on your SD card. If you want to take a time-lapse at day, you have to use an ND filter. We will always use a long time exposure, I will explain later why, and without this filter you will get a completely white image. So I would recommend an ND1000. And those filters have an f-stop reduction of 10. I tried once 3 filter for just 15 euros, but I wouldn't recommend those because everything was in shades of red, so you might want to spend a bit more on those. And finally, we need the Sony Time-Lapse app. It costs about 10 euros or $1, depending where you live. I will put links of everything into the video description. And before I show you how to set up your camera, here are some general tips. So this is my first try after I bought the Time-Lapse app. And as you can see, the video looks kind of jaggy. And if we compare to this one, this looks much smoother. And you really see the fluent movement of the cars and the people. But they both run with 25 frames per second. So why is this happening? If you look closely at the first one, you see that the cars don't really seem to move, they just pop in. And if you take a single frame, you see it looks like there's just a car standing on the street. And that's because there's no motion blur. So to get a smooth result, we need to use a long time exposure, because only then all movements will result in a blur, and this blur is needed to get the impression of movement. So I would recommend to use at least an exposure time of 1 second. But if you do this in broad daylight, you will get of course a completely overexposed image. And you might think, well, I could just bump up my f-stop number, but this won't be enough, and also you will get a fuzzy result. And this is called diffraction blur, which occurs if you use a very high f-stop number. To make long story short, here is an example for you to show what diffraction blur is. So this image is taken without any editing and zoomed in to about 250%. And you see the first one was taken with an f-stop of 6.3. So let's compare this to an image with an f-stop of 22. And compared to the previous one, you see this is much more blurred. And that's because of the higher f-stop value. Let's do it again. So this is 6.3 and 22. Generally, an f-stop of 6 to 8 will give you the best result in terms of diffraction blur. This of course depends on your lens, but I wouldn't use a much higher f-stop as 14 or 16 if I can avoid it. So that's why you should use a neutral density filter to avoid overexposure at daytime. And now I want to show you how to set up your camera with the Sony Time-Lapse app. So let's start with the camera settings. At first we want to make sure that we are in manual mode, as you can see in the upper left corner. And then let's go to Menu, and you might want to turn off Long Exposure Noise Reduction. It's a really great feature, but the camera will take a second image, and this might intersect with the interval of our time-lapse. So now, let's navigate through the application list, choose Time-Lapse, and you see we have several themes here we could use, but I would always recommend to use the custom settings, because those give us much more control. So now let's go to Menu again, and choose Application Settings. At first we want to change the file format. The video icon means that the camera will create a video by itself. So this would mean we have almost no possibilities in post-processing. So we choose the second one. And now it will save single raw images. With the interval you can set up after how many seconds the camera will take a picture. This depends on how fast the objects you want to take a time-lapse from are moving. If you, for example, want to record people doing their shopping, then you should use 1 or 2 seconds. If you have something very slow, like the movement of clouds, I would use 4 to 6 seconds. And for really slow things, like the movement of stars, 30 to 60 seconds. The shots determine after how many pictures the camera stops recording, and here you have to think which frame rate your final video should have. Then divide the number of shots by the number of your frame rate, and you know how long your final video will be. For example, if your final time-lapse should have 25 frames per second, and you choose 300 shots, 300 divided by 25 is 12. So you will get a time-lapse of 12 seconds in the end. AE should normally be on lock, so the camera will take every image with the same settings to achieve a consistent and flicker-free video. However, if you know your light conditions will change drastically during your time-lapse, for example if you record from sunset into the night, then you have to activate EA tracking. So here's an example of mine, what happens if you don't. You see in the beginning it's overexposed, and in the end it gets darker and darker, not to mention the annoying reflection in the windows. In this case you should activate AE tracking. And low, mid or high determine how fast the camera will adjust its settings to the light conditions. And finally at the bottom the duration shows how long you have to wait until your time-lapse is finished. So now press enter. And we are back in the menu. So let's check some options here. I will use the self-timer of 2 seconds and an aspect ratio of 16 to 9. And very important is that you set quality to raw, so we get the best quality out of our images. Focus mode, we choose manual focus. And always the lowest ISO, because I want to avoid noise as much as I can. White balance on auto. And that's it. So let's press menu again. And now let's set up our f-stop. For landscapes, for example, I would choose something between 8 or 14. And now very important, the exposure time. The exposure time is depending on the interval you have chosen. If you use an interval of 5 seconds, remember the camera takes every 5 seconds an image, then you can only use an exposure time of 5 seconds or less. As a rule of thumb, the longer the exposure, the smoother your result will be, but you will also lose details in moving objects. However, you can use this for cool effects. Try to take a time-lapse of people with an interval of 5 seconds and 5 seconds exposure time, and they will probably look like wisps of smoke rushing through the streets. To check your settings, press the C2 button for a test image. And finally, press the release to start your time-lapse. After the camera is finished, you will end up with a bunch of images. And how you can edit those without taking care of every single image, I will show you in the next video. So I hope I see you all there.